Novigrad, city of opportunity, city of freedom, city of fear and contempt, city of poverty and faith, city of wealth and recognition, city of contrasts. In the Witcher world, there is probably no analog to the free city of Novigrad. For hundreds of years, it stands at the crossroads of all trade routes of the continent and the Great Sea. And for hundreds of years, it has been independent. Neither Redania nor the almighty Nilfgaard can control it, and no one has ever laid siege to it. This city attracts the attention of adventurers from all over the world. It's a key point of trade for the northern kingdoms. All merchants have been to Novigrad at least once. Everyone dreams of finding their place in this city, but what many don't realize is that the city actually has power. This power is not concentrated in the hands of nobles. The bosses of Novigrad did not ride in carriages, nor do they build castles. They hide in inns, walk through dirty alleys, negotiate in dark, windowless rooms. They plot and kill each other. They build up their power by constantly risking their lives. Their goal is power, but in the meantime, they have to get along with each other somehow. They're murderers, sadists, and plain bastards. They keep the whole town in fear, unscrupulous and cruel. They don't tolerate weakness. They're the leaders of criminal groups. They're the leaders of dangerous gangs whose names the merchants of Novigrad wish they had never heard. They divided the city and its spheres of influence among themselves. Each has his piece of the pie. They are the Syndicate. And we are the Old Witcher team, which thanks you guys for the support on Patreon, without whom the videos here would be released much less often. Everyone else is also encouraged to join the squad on Patreon or subscribe right here on YouTube. In the meantime, let us start our story. The Syndicate awaits. The underworld of Novigrad was formed long before the Syndicate and the Big Four. Even from the moment of its foundation, the city attracted all kinds of rogues and other scum. It's not surprising because Novigrad was growing and developing real fast. Being located at the crossroads of trade routes allowed the city to become a real gem of the northern kingdoms. Add to that the self-rule and the status of a free city, and you get an ideal place for those who are looking for their own fortune. Some kind of adventurers united among themselves in a kind of quote-unquote clubs of interest. They looked for like-minded people, gathered hot newcomers, and formed factions. These same factions eventually became very numerous. They constantly fought each other, made treaties, and battled over territory. Novigrad became a kind of a separate state with its own shadowy rulers and hidden conflicts. Closer to the second half of the 13th century, according to the Elves' calendar, just as the Brenna battle was winding down and the Second Northern War was drawing to a close, the criminal life of Novigrad came to a critical point. Different gangs in their desire for power stopped seeing any boundaries, doing bloody battles right on the streets of the city, not hiding from anyone. And this led to the fact that Novigrad began to lose its profits. Cargo ships began to avoid the port, and various merchants were afraid to start their business here. The city started becoming poor, and no one liked it. It was not very profitable to rob the poor inhabitants of a city that no one needed. Then the heads of the 5 most powerful criminal gangs finally negotiated. They gathered for a meeting where they decided that the way of the war was taking them nowhere. At that meeting, it was decided to give the spheres of influence and the territory to the city according to the needs of one or another gang, dividing that. After long arguments and many threats, all the necessary decisions were made. The leaders of the criminal groups shook hands and so established a new order of gang life in the city of Novigrad. These 5 organizations supplanted or absorbed all other factions. They called themselves the Syndicate, completely occupying the spheres of influence in the city. First, let us talk about the gang of the Skelligian pirate, Gudrun Björnsdottir. It was called the Tidecloaks, settled in the docks of Novigrad, and kept under its control everything that was connected with merchants on huge sailing ships. As we mentioned before, Novigrad's location was such that all merchant ships from the north and south came into its port. The docks were bursting with all kinds of goods, and of course, the whole movement needed a leader, someone who would divide all the shares in the business and provide the merchants with a so-called cover-up. The Tidecloaks led by Gudrun, took on this heavy burden, and few people know how grateful the merchants were to this noble Skelligian lady, for if they did not show their gratitude strongly enough, they could be in big trouble. The Tide Cloaks were made up of Skellige pirates. It was hard for them to shake off their pirate past and to stay on land for long. It was not uncommon for their ships to leave Novigrad and plunder the coastal settlements to the north and south under neutral flags. Gudrun, on the other hand, was known by all. She was the true storm of the Great Sea, and legends about her spread all over the world when they saw her ship called Flinder. Merchant ships hurried to surrender and give up some of their goods voluntarily, as long as they were not touched. In Novigrad port, the pirate found a second home and kept the city's docks under her thumb. Her Flinder was the real fear of the city, but sometimes it nearly sank from the sheer weight of the looted jewels on board. Bandits from the Tide Cloaks would throw boarding hooks right over the roofs of the houses. When people heard this rumbling, all they could do was grab their valuables and lock themselves in their cellars, hoping they would not be found. Gudrun herself was a woman of steel. More than once, she has proved to various men from the mainland that women on Skellige carried weapons for a good reason. And more than once, she had rejected the advances of those that sought her hand. There was only one person in the whole life who could influence Gudrun and evoke warm emotions in her. That was another pirate named Imke, who immediately noticed that Gudrun was paying attention to her and decided to take advantage of it in a way. Imke became Gudrun's lover and quickly won the heart of the leader of the Tide Cloaks. She took great advantage of her position, and Gudrun's eyes were clouded with intense feelings. So Imke became the only weakness of the leader of the Tide Cloaks, and indirectly led to the fact that in time this formidable gang disintegrated. But we might return to this later, because now we move on to the second part of the Syndicate. The Church of the Eternal Fire. True, it was nothing more than a group that shared the spheres of influence in Novigrad with all the other gangs, and it was part of the Syndicate. The Church of the Eternal Fire took the Temple Isle of the city under its control, but this organization extended its influence to the entire population of the commercial capital of the north without exception. The leader of the church, Hierarch Cyrus Hemmelfart, was probably the most important and influential member of the Syndicate. He had an incredibly boisterous voice and oratorical skills. He controlled the crowd with skill, spreading among the people absolutely different feelings, from hearing hatred to love and hope, except the fact that one could only love or hate those whom Hemmelfart himself pointed out. All the non-humans, alchemists, healers, and even sorcerers avoided the Temple Isle and the Eternal Fire's minions. In the meantime, Hemmelfart continued to impose what was in his interests on the people, and the people in need of faith believed every word of the hierarch. Hatred of non-humans, fear of the Eternal Fire, and the need to sacrifice all of themselves to the church. Cyrus was able to develop all of these feelings and desires in people. He absolved sins, and thus encouraged the faithful, and if it was necessary to punish someone, he could use the services of the Inquisition, or simply excommunicate the unwanted, which in fact meant a death sentence to the unfortunate. He had a whole army of the Firesworn at his disposal, just waiting for the moment to start punishing sinners according to their merits. The hierarch himself lived in luxury. He dressed in satin and silk, consumed the most expensive wines and the rarest dishes. He collected the lion's share of donations from ordinary people for himself. He kept whole brothels that supplied him with juicy young girls, with whom he liked to have fun even more than to preach. Nevertheless, almost no one dared to speak out against Cyrus Hemmelfart. He had gathered too many loyal people around him, and even if there was someone who allowed himself to besmirch the bright name of the hierarch, he was quickly caught and slowly burned at the stake in the main square of the city. Subsequently, few dared to speak again about Hemmelfart's life. The Firesworn have done terrible things, but all of them were within the bounds of their faith and in the name of it, justifying any atrocities by the need to eradicate evil from the world. Therefore, ordinary people often took their side, continued to make donations to them, and shouted with joy when another heretic was burned alive on the pyres. In contrast to the Church of the Eternal Fire, which encouraged racism and persecution of non-humans, there was a gang that could shelter those non-humans. It was called the Crown Splitters, and it was led by an impossibly practical dwarf named Carlo Veres, who was better known by his nickname, Cleaver, fiery and aggressive. Cleaver was not the kind of man you could negotiate with. Either you agreed to his terms, or he will cut off your fingers with his famous cleaver and chop off your legs with his equally famous axe. The choice was that simple. If you want to trade in Novigrad, you'll have to get Carlo Veres' approval, or else you'd better run out of town while you still have a way to run. The Crown Splitters have taken control of the non-human neighborhoods, and every elf, dwarf, or halfling in Novigrad knew that it was actually much easier to survive under Cleaver's thumb. The city guards would hardly help a non-human even if he bled to death, but Carlo Veres treated all of his subordinates as kin. The most important thing is not to betray him and not to do anything he might consider a betrayal. Or better yet, write a comment under this video and give it a like. Otherwise, the remains of your corpse will feed the fish at the bottom of the Ponta River. Just kidding. Or not. As a young dwarf, Cleaver worked in a slaughterhouse, cutting and butchering pigs. But as time went on, he realized that cutting up people was no more difficult than cutting up swine. And with this conviction, he quickly became a big shot in Novigrad. For lack of alternatives, Novigrad's non-humans rallied around Carlo Veres, and he did protect them. No one in the city dared touch Cleaver's men, and the leader of the Crown Splitters himself never hid from his enemies, in contrast to the dwarfs in other cities who tried to live inconspicuously and pulled up their hoods in crowds to avoid attention. Cleaver looked flashy. Precious rings adorned his fingers. Gold chains glittered on his neck. His head was crowned with an rock, and his tattooed torso was rarely covered even by a shirt. Such a person was hard to miss, and Cleaver liked it. The Crown Splitters obeyed Cleaver unquestionably and were the most loyal gang in Novigrad. They were able to create strong ties with their brothers in the shopping districts and established a complete monopoly over the city's blacksmithing business. They were feared. They were not to be crossed. They were the only group of non-humans who could boast such status. But among humans, the most brutal was a group of cut-ups, led by the clan of Wileys. This gang was founded by a certain Alonso Wiley, an incredibly cruel man who had worked his way up to his status from the very bottom. Alonso's sadistic tendencies were a household name. There wasn't a single man in all of Novigrad with whom he didn't have a score to settle. Even with hierarch Hemmelfart himself, Wiley had not been on the best of terms, and no amount of support from the commoners made any difference. Wiley had gathered around him the same sadistic and unscrupulous killers that the townsfolk usually hid from in their homes, hoping they would be spared a terrible fate. Alonso Wiley was nicknamed Whoreson for his cynicism and cruelty. It was said that he killed his wife by hand in front of his own son. The junior, however, was not let go. The father often beat him and taught him terrible things. He made him train dangerous, bloodthirsty hounds. Alonso's only healthy attachment was art. The bandit adored paintings and poetry and was willing to pay a lot of money for rare drawings by well-known artists. It is said that Whoreson Junior suffered his death at the hands of his own son, whom he had raised as a real animal. Cyprian Wiley, or as he was known on the streets, Whoreson Junior, allegedly killed his father on his way to a poetry recital. Afterwards, he took over as the leader of the cut-ups, and together with this group, he became a member of the first Novigrad Syndicate. Whoreson Junior even surpassed his father in sadism and bloodthirstiness. Alonso Wiley raised a worthy heir to his cause. Cyprian's characteristic was his love of dismembering whores. Sometimes he ordered several girls at a time in a brothel, and no one returned. The fate of these girls was worse than death. The bastard abused them, maimed, tortured, and then killed them. It's better not to know what he did with their bodies. He was also ambitious. He dreamed of bringing down all the leaders of the Syndicate and taking over the crime in Novigrad himself. But at first, Cyprian Wiley had to settle for the same status as the others. The Cut-Up's gang had their own casino and arena where bets were accepted. The loan sharks of Novigrad also gave them a large share of their earnings. They were forbidden to enter the territory of other groups. Whoreson's freak show were terrifying to almost everyone who did business with a monster. But it was hard to find weak-willed people in the underworld. Everyone knew that Psychopath's blood was the same as everyone else's. The only thing that really hindered negotiations with Whoreson was his unpredictability. He could be smiling sweetly in conversation, and the next moment, his dogs were tearing his recent business partner to shreds, just because Whoreson wanted to have fun. Anyone who came to Cyprian Wiley's house had to realize they were dealing with a psychopath, just like anyone who met his henchmen from the Cut-Up's gang. The last major faction of the Syndicate is called the Blind Eyes and is made up mostly of poor people with nothing to lose. Novigrad is a city of contrasts. Many came there in search of a better life, in search of a place in this world, but only a few of this mass of the dispossessed have achieved any goals. The rest stayed on the streets, looking for work for a pittance, making do with scraps, begging in the alleys, hoping to scrape together enough money for another dose of fish stack. As the city grew, more and more of them were coming, and finally there was a special someone who was ready to gather all the poor and give them a second chance. A leader they would follow. His name was Francis Bedlam, and he wasn't just a philanthropist. He used people for his own ends. With the help of beggars, thieves, whores, and street kids, he created a whole network of the Blind Eyes. And no, they were not stealing money from the Vivaldi Bank for him. They were doing something much more important: getting information. Over the years, Francis Bedlam has realized that nothing in this world is more important than information. That is why he created a group that supplied him with all the latest gossip, inconspicuous papers that someone important had lost right out of his pocket. He was not interested in money, only power, preferably unlimited power. The common people nicknamed Francis the King of Beggars, and he liked that title, but he was a vain man. Nevertheless, Francis did not like to shine in public. He wore simple clothes, did not stand out from the crowd, and rarely appeared in loud companies. Nevertheless, the beggars somehow recognized their king even in the crowd, perhaps by the one gold ring on his finger. They bowed to him and kissed his hand. He helped many of the destitute in return for their service, and for that they loved him. Few knew how Francis Bedlam looked, and even fewer knew where he lived. And the few who did receive the coveted information about the King of Beggars were not in a hurry to use it. Still, he had set up his quote-unquote palace in the stinking and filthy putrid grove of Novigrad, which was disgusting to even think about. Stench and waste filled that neighborhood. Beggars and drug addicts pestered strangers, hoping to get a coin from a kind soul, and the Blind Eyes lurked in the shadows. One false step, and there wouldn't even be a shank left in the passerby's pockets. In addition to the Bits Quarter, the Blind Eyes controlled the Glory Lane and the Gildorf, but their ears were everywhere, so no one wanted to have any quarrel with the King of Beggars. There was no telling what he knew, or what he might tell the people of Novigrad about Cleaver, Whoreson Junior, or even the Honorable Cyrus Hemmelfart. Rumors always spread very quickly, and it was not easy to find the one who started them. In addition to the 5 gangs and their leaders, there was one man in Novigrad who was known, feared, and respected on every level. His name was Sigi Reuven, but in the past, everyone called him no other than the Honorable Sigismund Dijkstra. He grew up in a simple family, but thanks to his natural intelligence, cunning, and determination, he was able to rise to the rank of head of intelligence for the Kingdom of Redania. During the Second Northern War, he was in fact the most powerful man in all of Redania, but when his skills were no longer needed, Dijkstra was quickly betrayed and forced to flee. His entrepreneurial spirit was still intact, and soon he secretly returned to Novigrad under the name of Sigi Reuven. It turned out that he had not lost his sharp mind either, so he quickly established ties with the really important people of Novigrad, the heads of criminal groups. He helped them and quickly gained their trust, and when the Syndicate was created, Sigi Reuven was the neutral judge, the one who set the rules. Sigi Reuven created a code of criminals for the secret government of Novigrad to follow. Simple as that. The bandits who tried to negotiate also needed unbreakable rules. Otherwise, No treaty makes sense. And so they formed a code of conduct. Thankfully, Sigi Reuven understood how to turn any of its clauses to his advantage. Soon he became indispensable to the heads of the Syndicate. He kept accumulating influence, gradually surrounding himself with trusted men. He pretended they were just bodyguards, but in fact, he was forming the basis for his own gang, Sigi Reuven's gang. He's going to need that gang very soon. After all, the Syndicate, being glorious and satisfactory to all of them, will crack at the seams, and only the strongest will survive. There's going to be another split and another redistribution of power. Too many people in the Syndicate want more and are willing to do anything to get it. While the All Witcher team wants to get your likes, subscriptions, and comments. Not quite as much as Whoreson Junior does, right? Do support our work on Patreon or with a direct sponsored subscription right here on YouTube. For the support, we definitely thank our patrons. Without you guys, the Witcher videos on our channel would be released much less often. Up ahead, the gangs of Novigrad have another division of power, so hit the bell so you don't miss our next videos. Huge thanks to each and every one of you for every view, and see you soon when the Your Witcher speaks once more.